Hello, my name is Rory Lee, and the title of my presentation is It Reeks Like a Boy's Locker Room, Twitter's Digital Aphorisms and Toxic Masculinity. To begin, I want to apologize for not being physically present at today's conference. Unfortunately, due to both family and financial constraints, I was unable to attend. That said, I'm hoping that this video presentation will suffice. Last Friday, May 18th, a set of news stories garnered a lot of traction on Twitter. Nellie Bowles' New York Times profile of Jordan Peterson, President Trump claiming the FBI planted a spy in his campaign for political purposes, a school shooting in Santa Fe, Texas, resulting in 10 deaths, and Trump introducing a new rule to withhold federal funding from facilities that provide abortions or refer patients to places that do. In enumerating these stories, I'm taking the risk of revealing when I started to effort in earnest on this presentation. But more so, I'm drawing attention to a through line across these stories, namely toxic masculinity. Whether it's Peterson's advocacy for what he calls enforced monogamy in light of the incel movement, Trump's deliberate distortion of empirical data in order to obfuscate his campaign's nefarious actions, the Santa Fe shooter's impulse to kill his peers because a female classmate rebuffed his unwanted advances, or Trump's and the GOP's belief that men should control and regulate women's bodies via forced birth. All of these stories are symptomatic of an entrenched patriarchal culture that promotes and normalizes toxic masculinity. I learned about each of these stories through one of my Twitter feeds. In doing so, I read tweets that circulated these stories as well as tweets that commented on and discussed these stories. The predictably incendiary conversation, if we can even call it that, which unfolded was emblematic of the catch-22 nature of Twitter. As a platform, it has the potential to generate insightful discussion and bring people together, and yet, as evinced through our most recent presidential election, it can be weaponized by a foreign enemy to undercut our democracy and our values and to sow division between and within political factions. Technology, how it's developed and how it's subsequently used, is, as Bolter and Grusin remind us, reflective of a long history of remediation. But such technological development and usage are also a reflection of the culture in which the technology is created and adopted. And that makes what happened with and through Twitter in 2016, what continues to happen in 2018, particularly frustrating because we should have anticipated and seen it coming. Like Bolter and Grusin, Gettleman and Pingree note in the introduction to their collection, New Media, 1740 to 1915, that when a new medium is introduced, its meaning, its potential, its limitations, the publicly agreed upon sense of what it does and for whom, has not yet been pinned down. They go on to say that part of the lure of a new medium for any community is surely this uncertain status. Not yet fully defined, a new medium offers possibilities both positive and negative. During its inception, Twitter was more or less a remediation of the Facebook status update. It was marketed as a means to archive and share your mundane daily doings, such as a cereal you ate for breakfast, with family and friends whom you might not talk with daily. Since then, Twitter has evolved into a platform that provides its users many other affordances. For instance, and as already implied, it has become one of, if not the primary way, in which we consume and engage with news. But as we also know, our practices with and through Twitter vis-a-vis the news can easily create echo chambers that can exacerbate confirmation bias and leave us susceptible to fake news. When I teach my students about the deicity of technology, that is, our collective tendency to find uses for technology that are different from the purposes envisioned in its original design, I almost always use Twitter as an example. My description of the deicity of technology, what Kathleen Yancey identifies in her 4 C's Chair's address as one of the 3 key expressions that should underpin a new composition curriculum for the 21st century, is usually descriptive rather than evaluative. Now, however, I wonder how much I've erred in such an approach, how much our teaching and discussion of the deicity of technology needs to be more evaluative, needs both to highlight current abuses of technology and to anticipate future ones. While we clearly didn't anticipate not only the way that Twitter would become the political force it is today, but also, and perhaps more importantly, the way that Twitter would be hijacked to undermine our democracy, we should have recognized the likelihood that it would quickly become oversaturated with and be used in the service of toxic masculinity. While emerging practices with technology can change society, those practices are also, as noted, regularly a reflection of our society. And our society, unfortunately, is a hotbed of toxic masculinity. Twitter is particularly suitable for demonstrations and performances of toxic masculinity, which encourages men to eschew emotions in moments of vulnerability and instead express themselves in ways that exert dominance and reify misogyny. Men already feel entitled not only to talk, but also to flex the power conferred to them in our culture. Twitter grants them a platform to continue this practice, but to and at the expense of a wider audience. Although the behaviors illustrative of and common to toxic masculinity are both condoned and normalized in our culture, performing and promulgating them on a social media platform like Twitter has the potential not only to make toxic masculinity appear even more normal, but also to entice those who might otherwise reject such notions of masculinity to instead acquiesce and embrace them more fully. On Wednesday, May 16th, 2 days before the last Friday and the publications of the news stories I referenced at the start, The Independent ran an article by Damian Walter titled, "How White Male Victimhood Got Monetized." In it, Walter writes that any alt-right demagogue who can gather 1,000 whining, bitter, angry men with zero self-awareness now has a self-sustaining full-time job as an online shitposter. While Walter is drawing attention to the ways that men, and a few women, can now commercially benefit from defending toxic masculinity, a very unfortunate side effect of our collective efforts to expose, unpack, condemn, and resist toxic masculinity, especially online, his article also illuminates the way Twitter, in its current instantiation, offers toxic masculinity a platform to perform, uphold, justify, and spread its values and behaviors in the face of our civic obligation to render them socially repugnant and destructive. In Andrew Keene's Web 2.0, the second generation of the internet has arrived and it's worse than you think. He laments the rise of social media because he believes that if you democratize media, then you end up democratizing talent. I always found Keene's argument rather inane and laughable. The cultural flattening that he feared wouldn't really materialize, I thought. If anything, and as we've seen, this so-called democratization of media has only worked to expand the number of people who have access to the literacies and the tools needed to enter the elite class Keene lauds and desires to sustain. However, when I revisit Keene's argument, I think about it not through the lens of popular culture and art, as Keene overtly intended, but rather through the lens of ideas. And it's through that lens that Keene's concern sounds an alarm that should be deafening. The digital, and Twitter in particular, offers a space where the tenets of toxic masculinity are given a platform equal to those who espouse and promote values to which we should aspire. As a kid, I could, though not as easily, find or encounter published rhetoric that perpetuated toxic masculinity. Today, on Twitter, I'm not sure I can go a day without not only seeing it, but also witnessing it being defended. Which is also to say, Twitter extends and amplifies the mass privilege those describing to and enacting toxic masculinity already possess, permitting them to jump into mentions with tweets that begin with, "actually," and that gaslight the experiences and ideas of those less fortunate than them. Moreover, men are more likely to exploit their privilege on Twitter because the repercussions for doing so are more or less diminished. Men don't have to direct their rhetoric to someone's face, but rather the screen behind which they can conceal their identities and distance themselves from human reaction. Twitter's character limitation, once 140, now doubled to 280, can also increase the instances of and men's proclivity to lean into and perform toxic masculinity. And this leads me to the aphorism, and in part the title of my presentation. Marshall McLuhan was known for many things, perhaps most notably his work on hot and cold media and his phrase, "the medium is the message." But as a writer, McLuhan is also remembered, and in many cases revered, for his aphoristic style, one made conspicuous by the way it contrasted the long-form rhetoric common to most 20th century print texts. While short-form print rhetoric wasn't necessarily uncommon, Think the postcard, the recipe, the shopping list. Digital rhetoric, in many ways, is marked and identified by its short-form texts. Facebook status updates, Instagram feeds, infographics, Reddit posts, GIFs, and memes are all examples of short-form genres common to and constitutive of digital rhetoric. But one short-form genre in particular, the tweet, is perhaps our best example of the digital aphorism. To be sure, many tweets reflect well the insightful and thought-provoking rhetoric associated with McLuhan's work. However, a substantial number of tweets not only are absent of digital phronesis, our conference's theme, but also enact a toxic masculinity that works to harass and gaslight, and therein silence minority voices. Now, in the waning days of the electronic media that in many ways defined both the era in which McLuhan worked and the content of his work, and now in the early, exciting, frenetic, fragmented, and disorienting days of the digital era, it's worth considering more critically the implications of the aphorism in digital environments. The pithiness that marks the aphorism and the digital aphorism that is the tweet seems conducive to performing and perpetuating toxic masculinity. Because upon scrutiny, toxic masculinity gets exposed for what it is, a pernicious gender construct that passes for acceptable behavior from and by men. But the aphorism, by definition, operates under the guise of a general truth, something that has been the bane of our field's existence since Plato claimed a moral high ground against the sophists by decrying what today some might call fake news, while he committed libel by putting words into people's mouths. Toxic masculinity isn't digitally confined to spaces such as Reddit and 4chan. It's not something that's conveniently summed up and snuffed out by a phenomenon such as Gamergate. It's an ideology and an identity marker that is embodied and performed online in almost every digital space. Twitter, however, is particularly ripe for, and I would argue actively promotes, toxic masculinity through its rhetorical design and inadequate moderation. The number of times that users have been suspended or been given a timeout for calling out or defending themselves against instances of toxic masculinity, for instance, is in itself disconcerting in terms of algorithmic action intended to moderate and regulate malicious activity. But if you still think Twitter isn't a problematic space, then I turn you toward the CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, who recently said the following on March 1st of this year in a series of tweets. We're committing Twitter to help increase the collective health, openness, and civility of public conversation and to hold ourselves publicly accountable towards progress. Why? We love instant public global messaging and conversation. It's what Twitter is, and it's why we're here. But we didn't fully predict or understand the real-world negative consequences. We acknowledge that now and are determined to find holistic and fair solutions. We have witnessed abuse, harassment, troll armies, manipulation through bots and human coordination, misinformation campaigns, and increasingly divisive echo chambers. We aren't proud of how people have taken advantage of our service or our inability to address it fast enough. Recently, we were asked a simple question. Could we measure the health of conversation on Twitter? This felt immediately tangible as it spoke to understanding a holistic system rather than just the problematic parts. Dorsey then identifies two organizations they're working with to try and measure conversational health, while acknowledging that he doesn't know if the indicators they offer are accurate, which results in him ultimately submitting a request for proposals for how to measure Twitter's health. Like Dorsey, I don't know how to measure it. However, I do know that one way to increase the health of the platform is to reduce the way the interface invites and abets in toxic masculinity. In the meantime, we as teachers of digital rhetoric can and should join the vanguard in making Twitter a healthier space. To that end, questions we need to ask ourselves as teachers of digital rhetoric include, but are not limited to, how should we address toxic masculinity in the classroom? How might we demonstrate the ways that toxic masculinity is performed online via sites such as Twitter? How might we illustrate the ways that toxic masculinity is written into our culture, and how might we help our students rewrite a culture that is less infected with and by toxic masculinity? How might we react to responses and rejections informed both explicitly and implicitly by toxic masculinity to our pedagogical efforts to expose and resist toxic masculinity? And can Twitter, given its counter movements and resistance efforts, such as the Me Too movement and the Rape Culture is Win movement, be a digital realization of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? And if so, how do we implement that? I realize that for many, what I've said today isn't really new. In fact, it simply represents the realities of participating on Twitter. Nonetheless, I think what I've said today bears repeating. After all, this is a conference that, over the years, has transformed into the home of the digital dude bro. Given my own privilege, that's an identity marker I can easily adopt and perform, and at times have. But I wonder, at what cost? As a teacher scholar in the field of digital rhetoric, I've had to reposition myself within the field so I can begin to focus on what really matters to those who participate online: social justice. Part of doing that work is to address toxic masculinity when we teach online composing and literacy practices. I'm not a gender scholar, but it's now my responsibility to become more of one, given the digital rhetoric our students are encountering and interacting with regularly. It's all of our responsibility. Thank you.